Hello and welcome back to the Dazed and Confused podcast, where we explore the tangled history of cannabis in America. I'm your host, Christian Maynard, a doctoral candidate in sociology at Washington State University.
Go Cougs! Yes, go Cougs!
And in this episode, we're diving into one of the most consequential and contradictory periods in U.S. drug policy, the era of war.
And I was like, yeah, it's going to be called the Eras Tour. See you there.
This was a domestic crusade that reshaped cannabis policy, rewrote public perceptions, and targeted a new generation of Americans.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects.
That was Ronald Reagan on the campaign trail in 1980. But the story of cannabis prohibition during this period begins much earlier, under Nixon. Let's rewind. The 1960s and 70s were years of upheaval. Millions of young people took to the streets, protesting the Vietnam War.
To the pickup zone. Just a peaceful walk in the sun.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report
demanding civil rights.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
And questioning authority. Baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, were coming of age and weren't quiet about it. During the 1968 presidential campaign, and later completed in 1973, Nixon promised to end conscription, the draft.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States.
He favored a volunteer-based army on the belief that the anti-war movement would be weakened if middle-class youth knew that they were not going to war. You've probably heard the chant, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote." That wasn't just a slogan, it became a constitutional reality with the ratification of the 26th Amendment in 1971, lowering the voting age to 18.
The reason the voting age should be lowered is not that 18-year-olds are old enough to fight, it is because they are smart enough to vote.
In a 1968 speech entitled Today's Youth, the Great Generation, Nixon called for an
expanded democracy
and suggested
present leadership has failed young America.
President Nixon courted the youth vote publicly, but privately, he played a different game.
In studying the New York Times release of the Gallup poll on youth, one lesson comes through loud and clear. It is imperative that we limit our registration wherever possible without announcing that that is our tactic to the non-college youth.
Nixon's strategy was clear: suppress the youth vote, harness conservative youth, and appear inclusive while being anything but. Meanwhile, cultural tensions around cannabis were bubbling. In 1972, then-Governor Ronald Reagan ranted in his diary after watching the movie 9 to 5 that he was angry at a scene where women got high instead of drunk. He called it, quote,
"Slept in, took a morning walk, then spent the afternoon with desk work. We had both sneaked out and bought Valentines for each other, and believe it or not, we did surprise each other. Ran a movie and had Dan Rugg and the others who have to go with us over for it. It was a comedy, Jane Fonda, Dolly Parton, and Lily Tomlin, 9 to 5. Funny, but one scene made me mad. A truly funny scene if the three gals had played getting drunk, but no, they had to get stoned on pot. It was an endorsement of pot smoking for any young person who sees the picture."
This is really good pot. What did you say it was called again?
Maui Wowie.
Well, I love it.
It's primo.
In 1969, Nixon initiated Operation Intercept. For 3 weeks, U.S. border agents virtually shut down crossings from Mexico, hoping to choke the cannabis supply. Traffic jams stretched for hours, business leaders fumed, and diplomatic tensions soured. Individuals claimed that they had to resort to using harder drugs because, quote, there was no grass around. One federal official remarked,
"We're measuring our success not by the quantity of seizures made, but by the price of marijuana, heroin, and other drugs on the market. It is raising their cost beyond the means of most young people in America.
Despite the frustrations caused by Operation Intercept, Nixon pressed on. In 1971, he declared,
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substance Act. Cannabis was criminalized and slotted into Schedule I, alongside heroin and LSD. This classification meant that cannabis had no medical value. Do you want to do this? Do you want to do the podcast cookie? This implied that cannabis had no medical value and a high potential for abuse. Unlike the Marijuana Tax Act, which applied a highly punitive tax to non-medical use, and alcohol prohibition, which prohibited manufacturing and trafficking, the CSA directly criminalized personal possession. As part of the Controlled Substance Act, a commission was established to study cannabis use outcomes. Nixon appointed Raymond Shafer, Republican governor of Pennsylvania, to lead the investigation. However, nearly a year before the findings were published, Nixon publicly declared that even if the commission does recommend that cannabis be legalized, I will not follow that recommendation. In 1972, the 1,000-plus page Shafer Commission report debunked several misconceptions, rejecting claims that cannabis was a gateway drug, or that it increased aggression, and suggested instead that cannabis might inhibit aggressive behavior. The commission ultimately recommended decriminalizing possession for personal use and small-scale distribution. In a private audio tape unearthed in 2023, recorded on March 6, 1973, Nixon acknowledged that cannabis, quote,
Let me say, I know nothing about it. I know that it's not particularly dangerous. I know most of the kids are legalizing it, but on the other hand, it's the wrong signal to this.
In the same tape,
I have no problem with the fact that there should be an evaluation of penalties on it, and there should not be these penalties that Texas say they have contributors or 10 years in jail or marijuana. That's wrong. In other words, the penalties should be commensurate with the crime. I know that in the paper the other day. My father turned in his old and then after he said, I didn't realize the penalty was going to be a sentence in 30 years. Penalties are ridiculous. That's what we can say. But we have not for legalization. I don't want to encourage the drug thing. We're starting to win the fight against drugs. This is not a time to let down the bars. We have to encourage, people to break over this threshold into the drug culture.
In a 2016 interview, John Erkelman, who served as Nixon's domestic policy chief, remarked,
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
After Nixon resigned because of his involvement in the Watergate scandal,
And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
oh hey, I didn't see you there. This is the Dazed and Confused podcast. Don't just zone out. Hit that like button, get subscribed, and comment something classy, like bring back disco ducks.
Absolutely keep a hummingbird as a pet, bro. It's no different than having a parrot or a parakeet. It's a bird, bro.
You really can't? And I'm not saying I agree with it. It's just that bird law in this country, it's not governed by reason.
President Gerald Ford carried the torch. Abroad, he expanded U.S. involvement in controversial crop eradication programs in Mexico, spraying Paraquat a deadly herbicide on cannabis fields, even though these crops were later sold to U.S. consumers. Although the administration claimed that Mexico directed and controlled the program, from 1973 to 1978, the U.S. provided approximately $40 million, primarily spent on American-made aircrafts, with DEA agents accompanying Mexican officials to ensure that the crops were adequately destroyed. Benjamin T. Smith, professor at the University of Warwick, examined actions taken by the DEA. U.S. personnel in Mexico had posed as potential buyers for drugs, with drug traffickers subjected to violent and lethal forms of punishment by both Mexican and U.S. officials. One U.S. agent recounted an event where a colleague had emptied a clip from a gun into a fleeing suspect until he was shot to pieces. In a 1975 grand jury testimony, an ex-agent remarked,
"Agents participated in the torture. Anybody, it didn't matter a shit who it was. They would actually participate in the torture of these goddamn people. I got caught up in a goddamn gunfight there myself and killed men. Now we were running into this kind of stuff constantly, all the time."
At home, even the Ford family wasn't immune to drug use. Jack Ford, the president's son, casually admitted to smoking pot. First Lady Betty Ford had struggled with alcohol and opiates abuse.
"I have found I am not only addicted to the medication I have been taking for my arthritis, but also to alcohol."
Still, Ford pressed on, calling drug abuse
a problem of deep personal concern to me, and one which requires a careful but forceful policy both at home and abroad.
But not everyone or every state went along with federal policy. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, which formed in 1970, led efforts to both reschedule cannabis at the federal level and decriminalize cannabis at the state level. In 1972, NORML submitted a petition to the DEA to either delist cannabis from the CSA, Controlled Substance Act, or reschedule the drug to Schedule 5. John Ingersoll, DEA director, rejected this petition, citing constraints from an international treaty, the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. This argument in favor of rejection was later dismissed, leading to a prolonged legal struggle over the classification of cannabis, discussed later. Because of advocacy efforts, several states deviated from the punitive regime by the advancement of policies like decriminalization, which eliminates incarceration as a potential punishment for the possession of small quantities of cannabis. Usually offenders are subjected to a fine similar to a traffic ticket. Oregon led the way in 1973. In Alaska, because of the 1975 case of Raven v. State, the Alaska Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the state's constitutional right to privacy covered the possession of cannabis by adults at home for personal use.
The use of marijuana, as it is presently used in the United States today, does not constitute a public health problem of any significant dimensions. It is, for instance, far more innocuous in terms of physiological and social damage than alcohol or tobacco.
In California, after decriminalization, arrests halved, with enforcement expenditures dropping from $7.6 million down to $2.3 million. In Ohio, residents experienced a significant shift from having some of the strictest to some of the most lenient laws at the time. In Downey v. Perini, 1975, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a sentence of 30 to 60 years for a first-time offender convicted for possession and sale of small quantities of cannabis was cruel and unusual punishment. During the 1970s, 420, a popular code word that was coined by 5 friends called the Waldos at San Rafael High School in California, which they used to signify the desire, and often the meeting times, to consume cannabis. 420 would become synonymous with subcultures associated with cannabis, stoners or cannabis enthusiasts. By the end of the 1970s, several states had decriminalized. Even throughout the era of war, with heavy-handed policies, a divergence had begun. A resistance was building in the courtrooms, legislatures, and advocacy groups. On the horizon, Jimmy Carter's presidency offered hopes of a ceasefire to the ongoing drug wars. This would not materialize. That's it for this episode of the Dazed and Confused podcast. If you want to make sure history doesn't get buried or repeated, consider joining my Patreon. It's $4.20 a month, and it helps keep independent research alive. So the next time someone tries to revive Nixon-era drug policies, we'll all know exactly what's at stake. The link's in the description.